Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron McElhenney, and I am honored to serve as the Executive Director for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I would like to welcome each of you today as we continue the 2023 NACOLE webinar series. NACOLE is an organization that works to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities they serve. One piece of that effort is this webinar series, where for the last 8 years, we have brought you information on effective practices in civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and important work being done in regards to criminal justice reform. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics regarding today's session. With so many of you in attendance, everyone has entered in listen-only mode. However, once today's presentation begins, you can access the area to type in your questions by simply clicking the Q&A icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You will also have the ability to vote on questions as they are posed by your fellow attendees to move them up in the queue. This will help us to address your most pressing questions in the short time we have together today. I also want to remind you that today's session is being recorded and will be available to you through the Attendee Hub, the same platform that you used to access today's live session. Your same login information will allow you to watch or rewatch the session shortly after we conclude. With the details out of the way, I'd like to move on our attention to today's session. As you know, we like to bring you a wide variety of information related to the work of civilian oversight. That is why I'm particularly excited to have retired Captain Spencer Fomby with us to discuss and demonstrate basic academy-taught use of force techniques used to effect arrests. However, before I turn things over to Captain Fomby, I'd like to welcome Jason Wechter, a longtime member of the civilian oversight community, a NACOLE board member, and chair of our Training, Education, and Standards Committee. Jason?
Thank you, Cami. I'm very excited to have retired Captain Fomby here. He is the former director of the Boise, Idaho Police Department Training, Education, and Development Division. He was previously employed by the Berkeley, California Police Department for 20 years. He is a certified instructor in firearms, defensive tactics, less lethal weapons, SWAT, public order, chemical agents, and de-escalation. He's a recognized subject matter expert in police tactics, and he's the section chair for the National Tactical Officers Association Public Order Section, which just issued a paper on handling of protests that I'm very interested in reading, and I think he's going to put a link to that in the chat. So thank you very much for being here, Captain Fomby.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Cameron. We're going to try to share the screen here. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So welcome, everybody. We're going to talk today about police arrest tactics. This is a very complicated area of policing, and hopefully, as you're interacting with the agencies that you oversee, you have some relationship with the training staff and get a chance to either visit the police academy, sit through a citizens academy presentation, or otherwise interact with the training staff. They will be able to give you a more in-depth presentation. It's very difficult to do this via webinar. The best case is we do this in person. We can actually do demonstrations and kind of talk through the tactics. We'll try to use visuals and also a lot of different videos that show training in a static environment, and also training, or what that training looks like when it's applied in the field. So my background, we talked about that in the introduction. The main thing here is I've been a defensive tactics instructor since 2007. I've been certified in the state of California to teach weaponless defense, impact weapons, which is all the different batons that police officers use, from the expandable metal batons all the way up to 36-inch riot batons. I've also been certified in the tactics we use to control people on the ground, and then all the different chemical agents that officers may use in a defensive tactics situation. I've also created 2 courses that are certified in the state of California on de-escalation. Those courses are focused on dealing with people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, in mental health crisis, or otherwise non-compliant, and then using certain tactics to get those people either to jail or to the medical assistance that they need. So when we're talking about defensive tactics, typically in an academy setting, there are blocks of training. I attended the academy in Sacramento, at Sacramento PD back in 2000, when I was training to go work for Berkeley PD. In that setting, we're training on things from a very basic aspect of teaching people like they have never had any kind of formal training, because a lot of police officers have absolutely no formal martial arts training. When I came to the academy, I had never even shot a gun. So they had to teach me everything from the beginning. And so it's a great opportunity to give really basic foundational principles, and then also get to a point where hopefully by the time that officer leaves the academy, they are competent in the skills they need to deal with people in the field. So some of the things that we talk about in an academy setting are body mechanics, and we're literally talking about how the body works, how joints work, the ways that will make it easier for an officer to put a person into a cuffing position, which ultimately, in a dynamic situation where an officer has to physically control a person, we need to get that person into a position where they can be placed in handcuffs. We also talk about managing distance. And so here you see an example, with this picture of an officer being attacked by a suspect. Partner is already on the ground, and then the officer is attempting to manage distance to avoid being struck by the suspect. We'll talk about control holds, takedowns, which are various techniques we use to physically control a person and get them onto the ground so we can get them into a cuffing position. And then ground control. We'll talk about ultimately getting a person into handcuffs. Most of the times that person is compliant, and the officer is then able to place them in the handcuffs without resistance. But then in other situations, the person is actively resisting or actually fighting the officers, and the officers have to overcome that resistance to place the handcuffs on. We'll also talk about personal body weapons, or what people will call strikes. Those are tools that officers have at their disposal in many agencies, but we have very specific ways we want officers to use those, and it should be used sparingly. We'll also talk about impact weapons and chemical agents. So when we look at the history of police defensive tactics, throughout the history of American policing, there has been a need to physically control people and sometimes place them into handcuffs when they are actively resisting or actually fighting the officers. A lot of the tactics that were developed over time came from traditional martial artists. So the people that were most influential in developing the modern tactics we use now were traditional martial artists who became police officers. One of them, Bob Koga, was very influential in a lot of the tactics that we use now. And when I was starting in the academy in 2000, my lead instructor was a person who studied under Master Koga. Those tactics are developed out of traditional Aikido, Judo, and Jiu-Jitsu techniques, and then adapted to the restrictions we have in police work. So I'll show you videos later where you may see sport applications of martial arts or self-defense applications that happen in the field. And there are techniques and tactics that we cannot use when the officer is working in their official capacity. There are certain things that you will see in an MMA fight that an officer should never do when they are performing their duties as a police officer in the field wearing a uniform. So that is one of the things we have to make clear to the officers, and as oversight professionals, it's important that you understand that distinction. And the focus in all these tactics is overcoming the suspect's resistance, and then also the officers do not give up the right to self-defense when they put on their uniform. So some of the challenges that we're facing in our profession overall, there's no national standards for most of the things that we do. And there's definitely no national standards for defensive tactics or arrest and control tactics. So if you go from agency to agency, state to state, you will see a wide variety of tactics, some of them effective, some of them questionable. And, there really is a need for national standards in every aspect of what we do in policing. There's a huge disparity in the training quality. So the actual training topics, the level or quality of instruction and the information that is received by the students. And then the number of hours is all over the place when you look at how many hours a police officer receives in just basic training and then ongoing training. And then when we talk about the training that they receive that is specific to defensive tactics, it is not consistent in the United States. Some states do not mandate any ongoing training on defensive tactics. So most states will have some requirement that officers have to at least qualify with their firearms, but some of those same states don't have any requirement that the officers will ever go into a MAT room and do a refresher training on all of these tactics that encompass defensive tactics. And then we know that defensive tactics are a perishable skill. So the officers are not fighting every day. They're not getting into knockdown, drag out fights, but they use some aspects of defensive tactics every day. So the way that officers stand when they're wearing the uniform, when they're contacting people, the bladed stance that officers have, keeping their gun side, strong side away from the person in a bladed stance. Those are the most basic aspects of defensive tactics. And those are things that officers, if they're practicing good officer safety skills, those are things that they're doing constantly, managing distance, not letting people get too close to them. And then when they're placing handcuffs on people, even when that person is compliant, there's some level of performing the control hold and then handcuffing. And we know that poorly trained officers are more likely to use excessive force. And I'm sure you've probably seen that in your work. And if you go down a rabbit hole on YouTube, you will see hundreds of examples of officers who are using excessive force. And my argument is they're typically doing that because they are so poorly trained, they're not confident in their skills, and they don't really have a good understanding or the physical ability to overcome resistance. So when we look at use of force, this is just general, is coming from case law. Officers can objectively use objectively reasonable force to overcome resistance, prevent escape, or effect an arrest, or they can always use that type of force, use force in self-defense. So this is just one source of information when we're looking at the Institute of Criminal Justice Training Reform. They did a deep dive and looked at the state of training around the United States, and this is what they found. So what I want you to focus on is starting with basic training hours. So when I went to the academy in 2000, we had over 1,000 hours of training and over 100 hours focused solely on defensive tactics. And what we're finding now is the average around the country is only 650 hours of training. So where I would argue that we need to increase the level of training, and if the average academy, in California was 6 months back in 2000, maybe we should look at how long that academy should be, whether it should be a year or longer. If we're talking to my colleagues in Germany, they're going to the academy for 2 years. In some countries, it's up to 3 years before they can even get a basic certification. So here we have 650 hours for the average officer in the United States. The thing that's extremely shocking to me is you have 37 states where they allow you to go out into the field and perform police duties without going to the basic academy. So in California, that wasn't the case. When I went to Idaho, I learned that Idaho was one of those places where we could make a person a full-fledged police officer and send them out into the field, and they didn't have to go to the police academy for a year. So in my opinion, that should never be the case. And then the other thing to focus on is yearly in-service hours. So if the average officer is only getting 21 hours of training a year, that's obviously not enough. If you just call it 3 days of training, by the time you do firearms and other legal refreshers, if you're adding any type of new training on, crisis intervention team, procedural justice, bias-based policing, all these different topics that the officers have to be aware of, how is there any time to train on these types of skills? So we look at the specific skills we're talking about. This information that I'm presenting is coming directly from the California Post-Learning Domain, or LD33. And this is the language that they use. So control holds are all the different tactics that officers use based in judo, jiu-jitsu, aikido, basic wrist locks, shoulder locks, and different controls to be able to place the person that the officer is dealing with in a position of disadvantage. So the officer has some level of control. The challenge when you're putting a person in control holds is that you are now in close proximity to that person. So if they want to strike you, if they want to grab you, it gives them that opportunity. The other challenge is control holds generally work on people that are somewhat compliant, but as people start to resist and fight, control holds may have limited effect. So these are examples of control holds that you might see if you're watching videos or if you see a training demonstration or go to the academy. All of these have, some utility, but the reality is when people resist, and I have used all of these in the field, when people resist, they can overcome these control holds. And so the challenge for the officer becomes, what do you do after a person starts to resist? How do you transition from this control hold that has now failed into some better level of control safely to make sure that the suspect doesn't get injured and that you don't get injured, and then ultimately get that person into cuffs? And so we'll see some videos in a minute that show some transitions that are less than optimal. And so you're looking at pictures of people operating in a sterile environment, in a training environment, and performing a technique perfectly. But then once you add in the resistance of another person, you're sweating, that person's sweating, environmental factors, all those things play into what it really looks like. And it never really looks like this. The next topic we'll talk about is personal body weapons. So this has been kind of a controversial subject in our profession. There are agencies that don't allow personal body weapons at all. I was trained in an agency where we were allowed to use personal body weapons. The main things that I would always point out to officers when I was teaching this is this shouldn't be your go-to. It shouldn't be a primary force option. One, striking doesn't really work that well unless, in a rare case, you completely knock a person out and incapacitate them in that way. When officers are using strikes, they call distraction strikes, or, they're striking to the meaty portions of a person's thigh or, some other part of their body in an attempt to overcome the resistance. That doesn't really do much. We really need to overcome their resistance using leverage and using specific tactics. So I'm sure you've probably seen videos where officers are using strikes that look questionable. There are times where, using strikes is reasonable. And, obviously one of the things is if a person is trying to punch an officer, the officer doesn't have to allow the person to punch them. They are allowed to defend themselves using personal body weapons. But where officers have an opportunity to use other tactics, most instructors would encourage them to do something other than strike. So we'll look at a couple of videos that demonstrate personal body weapons. So this video is actually going to show you what it looks like when people are using personal body weapons against officers and the situation that it puts them in and how they try to overcome this.
Fray. Police say 26-year-old Patricia Casher started the fight after she was kicked out of the Swamp Bar. As police tried to arrest her, court records say she started punching Officer Lee Berry. Casher then kicked Berry and fellow cop Matthew McCohen in the groin, knocking them to the ground.
You'll see people within the crowd start to beat on our officers.
The video shows a man in a yellow shirt repeatedly punching the officers. Casher was with a group of about 15 tourists from Mississippi and Florida who traveled on a party bus to New Orleans. 3 men with the group jumped into the melee, and later on, the video shows a 5th man with the group, who police identified as 23-year-old Alejandro Ford, holding a gun, walking around. A bystander tells one of the officers about the gun, and just by talking to Ford, the cop gets the gun.
After being kicked, after being headbutted, thrown against the ground, and becoming aware that a weapon was drawn in this confrontation, these officers still had the presence of mind to utilize their training to a positive end.
The video does not show a confrontation between an officer and tourist David Wilson, who police say headbutted one of the cops. Court records say police officer Christopher Amard shot Wilson with a stun gun when he.
So that's an example of the use of personal body weapons against officers. What you don't see in that video is the officers actually defending themselves using, batons or strikes or really much force at all. It is a very dangerous situation when officers are policing that type of environment. If you've ever been on Bourbon Street or in any type of party environment where a lot of people are intoxicated, and in this case, the officers are actually outnumbered by the crowd. I think they did a good job deciding on how they would interact with these people, defend themselves, get people into custody without escalating the situation further. And the officer that was able to disarm a person who already has their gun drawn, that's just excellent work. Now, this is an example of an excessive use of personal body weapons where an officer, becomes upset and takes it as a personal challenge. And what I want you to think about is the officer using force to overcome resistance, prevent escape, effect an arrest, or in self-defense?
I got all that. Don't worry about it. I'm not touching them.
So in this case, I think any reasonable officer would look at this and feel that, the officer is clearly using strikes in an offensive manner. The officer is not transitioning and trying to physically control this person. Even if he believes he has probable cause to make an arrest, he's not physically controlling him and trying to place him in a handcuffing position. He's just using strikes. And that is not something that we teach police officers to do. This is another example. Again, are the officers using force to get this person into handcuffs?
Sunday morning in Arkansas, you can see 3 officers in the images. These are those images. This is in Mulberry, Arkansas, in the west part of the state. What you see is they are kicking, they are using their arms to hold down a suspect. Now, the official report from authorities is that all 3 officers will say have been suspended. State authorities are conducting an investigation. We know that 2 belong to the Crawford Sheriff's County office, and 1 is a local police officer. All 3 suspended. Now, of the suspect, Jose, we know it's 27-year-old Randall Ray Worcester. He's facing 7 different charges. Among these are battery, assault, and even a terroristic threatening in the 1st degree. We know that the suspect was taken to a local hospital. He was looked at.
So as you watch officers delivering strikes, they have 3 officers on 1 person. What you don't see is them using force, using leverage to get him prone, get his hands behind his back, and get him into handcuffs. So all you see is strikes, everybody delivering strikes, slamming his head on the ground. That is a clear indication that their efforts are not meant to put him into cuffs. So the next thing we'll look at is takedowns. When we looked at those different control holds, when you go to these different courses as instructors and you teach these tactics to police officers, there are transitions from each of these control holds into takedowns. Now, the reality is most of them don't work very well. They take a lot of training. They take a lot of repetition. And I told you already that officers are not getting that much training. So the reality is when officers are under stress, they normally have 1 or 2 go-to techniques that they use, something they feel confident that they can execute under stress, and something they feel confident will work in the field. And so we'll look at a couple of examples. I found this video as I was doing research. This video actually does a great job giving you an idea of the landscape of police training, not just in the United States. It's pretty universal around the world, that we're having the same problems. But it will start with what is a traditional martial arts application that is taught to police and how that really works in the field.
Fortunately, most organisations whose job involves use of force, such as police, military and security, almost universally, they tend to teach their employees these low percentage techniques like wrist locks and armbar takedowns. And this is not isolated to any particular country. It's something that's somehow spread all over the world. And this similar training results in surprisingly predictable patterns of behaviour when they try to apply these methods in reality. So in accordance with their training, they'll first often grab at the wrists and arms and attempt to do these wrist locks and armbar takedowns. When this doesn't work, they'll often go for things like leg reaps, which are higher percentage, a more reliable method, and often part of their training too, but typically they have a low level of skill due to very little time spent in training. So this often doesn't work either.
This is the moment where I can attack for a turn throw safely because she is off balance.
So you're doing these multiple things at the same time, and it takes a lot of training to be proficient at it. But when you're working with a partner, you can divide up the upper body and lower body into different roles instead of doing it all yourself. And in this way, two people with much less actual training can get the job done just as effectively. This is Henna and Huron Gracie demonstrating the method that they teach to police in seminars. But this is not particular to this school. This is not something that they've discovered. It's really common sense. And it's not just in martial arts either. In fact, it's less common in martial arts than it is in some sports. Here's a rugby team drilling 1-man, 2-man and 3-man tackles. Watch any rugby match and you'll see it happening over and over again. It's not some special secret martial arts technique.
So I think this video does a great job showing, some of the issues that we have in our training. And I agree, he is spot on. This isn't rocket science. A lot of us have been doing this since we were kids, but it's just not taught formally in a policing environment. In most places, I went most of my career without ever having any type of formalized training on, doing a 2-person coordinated takedown and then transitioning to a handcuffing position. It wasn't until later in my career that we were trained that way and then also adapted it and started to push that out to our officers. So I'll show you a couple of examples of takedowns in the field. This is a trooper, again, down in New Orleans, dealing with a couple of drunk people. He's been called there to move these guys along. And basically what happens is the one guy will not leave. And then the trooper decides he's going to take him into custody, and then you'll see what happens.
How is this okay? How is this over there? How is this okay? Officer, how is this okay? Right, you're on video. Stand back, stand back, stand back, stand back. Stand back, stand back. Hey guys, come stand back, stand back. I worked out here, quick. I know. Hands on your back. How is this? Give me your hand. How is this? Hands on your back. How is this? Hands on your back. Hands on your back. Right. Give me your hand. I'm trying. Hands on your back.
So in this case, you see the officer doesn't use strikes, doesn't use personal body weapons. What he feels comfortable with is physically controlling people. So he pushes one person out of the way, happens to be the suspect's brother. pushes him out of the way, grabs the other person, tries to put him in a one-handed rear wrist lock, and then based on the level of resistance from the suspect, realizes he's not going to be able to handcuff him standing. And the only way you can really handcuff a person who's resisting that much is to get them on the ground in a prone position. So then he takes him down, again, still not striking, talking to him, telling him to roll in his stomach, put his hands behind his back, and he eventually gets him into a cuffing position. This is an example of officers, a lot of officers, trying to deal with one person. And I want you to watch, one, the number of officers involved. Are they working together as a team? And are they coordinated in their attempt to put him in cuffs?
Somebody grab an arm. Will, you got a wrap? Okay. Hey, the wrap's in the back of the first car. It's coming right now. Thank you.
Put in my car. Yeah, which one?
Mine has little strips of white out on the back. We'll
have someone to help you get your help, right?
So you see there, they had a lot of officers on scene, and once the subject tried to run away, officers approached him and tried to get him in custody. And quickly you have a lot of officers, and I would argue in that case, too many people, because yes, he's a big, strong guy. He's running away. He's not compliant, and the officers need to physically control him and get him down. But once you get so many officers, an individual officer cannot grab and control a limb, and they can't work together. That actually becomes a separate problem. So you see people trying to say, slow down, and some people not engaging and staying back and trying to coordinate that response and get him in custody. The next thing, and this is the challenge, what has been a challenge in our profession, we've taught officers to place people in control holds. When they resist, take them to the ground, but we have not historically taught them how to control people on the ground. And so there's been a concerted effort over the past 10 plus years to give specific training to police officers to teach them how to control people on the ground where most of these confrontations end up. And this is some of the training. This video is a little bit longer, but I think it's really important to show this is the direction that training is headed in police work and in your agencies that you interact with. Hopefully there's some formalized training that really goes to this aspect. So getting away from strikes and getting more toward body control, using leverage and a safer method. Trained with Henner. I got certified as an instructor for Gracie Survival Tactics. This course happened to be held at the Navy SEAL base down in Coronado. So there was police instructors and then Navy SEAL combatives instructors. They were actually introducing these tactics into the SEAL teams. So let's look at some of these applications in the field. That you'll see an officer who breaks up a fight and he has some understanding of ground control.
Atlanta police officer working the bars breaks up a fight, controls the civilian from behind with an over-under grip. Civilian gets up and falls back, crashing onto the pavement. Officer tries to get up, but the civilian builds the house first. Civilian overcommits on the pressure. Officer uses the momentum to beautifully sweep him in the opposite direction and take top mount. He maintains full composure, doesn't throw a single strike, and starts conversing with the civilian, who probably didn't know it was a cop on his back until this point. Another civilian tries to pull the cop off. He gives him the death stare, and he backs off instantly. Once the civilian complies, the officer gets up, helps him up, and they hug as they walk away with no arrest made. If we're gonna highlight the bad in the media, then we have to highlight the good as well. This guy is a legend, and we want to sponsor him to attend any Gracie Survival Tactics instructor certification.
This is an example of what happens when an officer doesn't have those skills.
We're now getting this up-close look at the attack on an officer inside the Harbor Division Station last month. The LAPD released a new video of the violent encounter. NBC4's Jonathan Gonzalez live at our News Operations Center with more. Jonathan.
And Michael, you know, we've shown our viewers portions of this video that was once leaked. It was surveillance video that we had shown our viewers, but now this is an edited video put out by the LAPD showing us body camera footage for the first time from that Saturday night last month at the Harbor Division in that lobby. A warning that some of our viewers, some of the audio and video from this can be difficult to watch or listen to. An LAPD officer calls for help after being assaulted.
You got my gun. You got my gun.
This body camera footage giving us a first-hand look at what happened the night of September 26th inside the lobby at LAPD's Harbor Division. Just before 10 o'clock, you can see a man in a truck pull right up to the police station's front doors. That man, 29-year-old Jose Serpa Guzman, acting erratic at the back of his truck before going inside the station, entering through a door that was supposed to be locked due to COVID protocol. That's when the front desk officer goes to check out what's going on, and the officer's body camera shows what happens next. Guzman walks in and immediately starts trying to punch the officer, who starts to back up and defend himself, but is eventually knocked to the ground. That's when this escalates into a very dangerous situation. As they're both fighting on the ground, you can see Guzman grab the officer's gun and begins to hit the officer with it while he's still down. Here's another angle of that moment. You can see the gun in Guzman's hand. Police say he tried to shoot, but the gun failed to go off. After Guzman runs away, that's when the assistant watch commander shows up and gets closer to the front doors. As Guzman shoots at her, she gets down and shoots back.
So the next topic we'll talk about quickly is neck restraints. This is obviously a controversial topic in law enforcement. In my career, I've never worked for an agency that was allowed to use these restraints. I was taught the karate control hold when I was in the police academy, but Berkeley PD had a ban on these holds. And then when I went to Boise, just prior to my arrival, they had already placed a ban on the hold. Without getting into the weeds, the main thing here, the main purpose is to cut off blood flow from the carotid arteries to the brain, which renders the subject unconscious. When applied correctly, people typically go unconscious within 15 seconds. There's obviously some potential issues if the officer applies that force to the trachea. You can cause damage there and then cause problems breathing. And then you also don't know the person that is the hold is being applied to could have pre-existing medical conditions, be under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and potentially go into some type of medical emergency. So if the agencies that you review have these types of holds, then I would suggest that you get a better understanding of how they are applied, how often they're applied, and what type of training the officers receive. This information, you'll be able to receive these slides. You can see this on your own, but there's information on what officers are taught as far as searches. So cursory searches or frisks for weapons, consent searches incident to arrest after the officer has probable cause to make an arrest and then conducts a search. And then this is an example of officers failing to search properly and failing to use good police tactics. And so what you'll see here is officers are responding to a call of a person with a gun. described as the female that you'll see on the screen, and that she has already discharged the weapon.
I told you, that's there, bro.
All right, stay here, stay here.
Thank you.
I might need you. Stay here, because I may need you. Young lady, do you have a firearm on you? Did you get into an altercation? Where you fired off a gun?
I did not fire him off. He fired him off. His girl. Whatever the fuck he is.
Stay over there.
Yeah, please stay the fuck away from me.
Okay.
I didn't do shit. You got your fucking people back. Look, I have everything on my fucking
Let me
phone.
see your phone. Let me see.
Everything's
Show
on
me.
my phone.
Show me who shot a gun. Show me.
I didn't have the video, but I have all this
you
fucking
said
proof on.
Show me your
written
proof that somebody shot
It's
the gun.
written fucking proof. This
Do you have
dude been
ID
threatening
first of
me.
all?
I have a temporary. He's been calling me, threatening me. I'll be back. I'll be back. Oh. And then he calls me, and he's like, he starts showing me around to all these fucking people. This is her. This is
Who
her.
shot
This
the
is
gun?
her. That bitch in there, the fucking Mexican, with the fucking bag.
Okay. Where did she shoot a gun at?
Towards me. Fucking piece of shit. Fucking lucky
Wait over
I
there
wasn't
for
still
me.
overseas. I fucking shot her ass.
Okay, sir, go wait over there. I don't need you on top of us.
I'm sorry, but my PTSD from overseas is fucking bad.
I'm going to ask you to go wait. I know. Okay, we'll deal with that, but I just got to ask you to wait over there. I've asked you 3 times.
I don't know. I mean, all I could tell you
Okay,
is
well, we're
there's
going to
a
look
lot
at the
of fucking
video out
videos.
here and see who shot what.
All right.
You had no gun?
I do not.
You got bullets?
Yeah.
What are the bullets for? That's big. 357 mag. She's got a scale. She's got some weed. I don't know what's in here. I was looking for a gun, but. All right, I think we're still under. Oh, we got some. What are these?
Is this in her property?
Yep, that's all her stuff. Don't be stupid. Yeah! She's got a
So there you see a person who was described as having a firearm, discharging the firearm. The officers contact the suspect, and instead of challenging her at gunpoint, making her keep her hands visible, going up and physically securing her in handcuffs and conducting a search, they allow her to stand there the whole time with a gun secreted in her front waistband. And when they go to physically go hands-on is when she draws the gun and shoots at the officers, and they return fire and shoot her. So following basic protocols, when officers fail to follow basic protocols and basic officer safety, this is something that can happen. So quickly talk about handcuffs. Again, you'll have all these slides, but this is the nomenclature of handcuffs. These are the different types of handcuffs. You'll typically see the ones with the chain. Those are the most often used. And then there are hinged or rigid. The hinged handcuffs make it a little bit more difficult to put the person in cuffs, but it doesn't allow the person who's cuffed to move around as much. So a lot of times these are officer preference on what they carry. So the cuffs should be applied between the wrist and ulnar bone. The shape should obviously go along with the shape of the wrist once the cuffs are applied. The officers need to make sure that the cuffs are not too tight and that the cuffs are double locked, and make sure the cuffs are not over any clothing or jewelry. And one of the principles we follow is never pull out handcuffs before you apply control. So this is an example of a control hold and then the application of cuffs. And this is what can happen if you don't follow this principle.
You need to gain complete control first. If you're holding one arm, they can use the other one to strike you. You're at a higher risk of being punched. They might even use the single handcuff as a weapon.
So to finish up, the future of defensive tactics, we need to use a data-driven approach. I work with a couple of organizations that are working with academics. We've done surveys with agencies to figure out what agencies are teaching and how effective that training is and what the officers are actually doing in the field. And our training needs to be based on actual scenarios that officers face, not based on these abstract concepts or things that instructors make up. And then we also need to stop training in silos. So typically that training is, based on the tactic. So we're going to do handcuffing training. We're going to do control holds. We're going to do takedowns. We're going to do personal body weapons. Then we'll do impact weapons all separately. It needs to be based on scenarios that officers actually face and use an approach that we call force options training. So the officers are actually making an assessment of the level of force they need to apply and then transitioning up or down based on what they face. And then ultimately, we need to improve human performance under stress, which is, a necessary skill for all aspects of policing, making sure that officers understand the limitations that happen when officers are having a physiological response to stress, and then how to overcome that and perform their best when they're in that condition. And this is my information. If anybody, ever wants to contact me, or if I can ever be a resource to anybody, please let me know. And hopefully we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Captain Fomby, for being here with us today and sharing that. We do have some time for some questions. We have quite a few of them in the queue, and if you don't mind, we'll just get to as many of them as we can in the time we have left. Our first question is there any sponsorship or ability for officers to attend the Gracie Police Control Tactics training? I attended this training a few years ago as an academy training instructor and martial arts instructor. I swear by it.
It is, the reality is it's a for-profit business. So, Henner and Huron, they are, I would say, the premier training organization right now in our profession. I also believe in it. I sent a bunch of my instructors from Berkeley down there, and I actually hosted the course in Boise. I brought it to Idaho for the first time. I swear by it. But, I don't know about sponsorships. They do sponsor people that they see in certain videos that go viral where the officers don't perform very well. But other than that, it is a system where, they want you to bring the course to your jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. And so our next question is how can we get officers the level of training they need to be competent or expert when recruitment and retention has become so difficult?
We just need to change the culture. And I think people who work in oversight can actually have some positive influence on this. You have influence on policies and training and equipment when it comes to maybe restricting things. But I think if you start to advocate that we want the officers to be trained better, that we want the academies to be longer, that we want more in-service training. If I were in your position and you want better outcomes, I would be arguing that these officers are not trained well enough. And, when you look at all these videos or you look at the events that you review, it is clear. I always point back to training. Yes, there are cultural issues, there are systemic issues, but when officers aren't getting any training, you really can't expect them to perform much better than they are.
Thank you. So while I keep an eye on the time. So the next one is thank you so much for being here. De-escalation can be very effective in avoiding significant use of force in many situations, jails and in the field. How can such training overcome the natural escalation that conflict engenders in officers?
I think one of the things that we try to teach is emotional intelligence. The officers, all of us have to understand what our triggers are. What are the things that cause us to have an emotional response, to start to have that physiological response. And, police officers are no different. We need to make sure that they understand that, and then understand the goal. My approach to teaching de-escalation and supervising very high-risk situations in the field was to make sure that everybody understood the goal. So I would go to calls like that person who is emotionally disturbed or in crisis, and I would tell people, okay, our goal is to get him to the hospital. I would just tell everybody on the scene, all right, guys, we're going to get him to the hospital. And it really changes people's minds on like what we're here to do. We're not here to, just use force on him or get him to jail or to, get him into custody. Our goal is to safely get him the help he needs. So I think that's one thing where it starts, but you really need to have a really concerted training program and make sure the supervisor's on board.
Wonderful. So the only other question I think we have time for is just there are several people who are hoping they can get more information on the paper about handling protests that was mentioned at the beginning of the session. And so there is no chat in this, but we can absolutely attach it to the recording that people will be able to access later if you don't mind sharing that.
Sure. And I can also email the document to Jason if you want to blast it out to everybody.
Perfect.
Okay.
Absolutely. So with that, Captain Fomby, I just want to extend my appreciation to you for joining us today and sharing your expertise with the civilian oversight community. NACOLE can't do what it does without those like you and others who are so willing to share your knowledge with all of us. I also want to thank you, Jason, for helping to bring this training opportunity to our audience. And of course, as always, I thank those of you who chose to be with us today for this important training. I want to ask you all to mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will be on July 13th. An email will be sent out shortly with registration details. We will be welcoming NACOLE member and police practice advisor Ashley Heiberger, who will join us to discuss the evolution of the use of force. Also, I would be remiss if I did not remind all of you that registration is open for our 29th annual conference, which will be taking place November 12th to 16th in Chicago, Illinois. For more information and to register, please visit nacole.org. So again, thank all of you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Again, thank you, Captain.
Thank you.